You have an economic policy which is founded on juju. I call it rain dance economics. They claim they want growth. What do? They increase taxes. This is bizarre.
What did you make of Rachel Reeves's spring statement the other day?
There was very little to make of it. I mean, there's a phrase in law which is de minimis non curat lex. The law does not concern itself with trifles. Do you know, young man, as I'm fond of teasing you, what the size of the state budget is in Britain? It is 1.2 trillion. That is to say, it is 1,200 billion pounds. What were the sums involved in her statement? They were less than 1%. These are margins of error. This is an argument about complete trifles. Everything she talked about, the cuts to welfare, the cuts to the civil service, they amount to less than 1% of the budget. That is a rounding error. We are locked in a loop of idiocy. It's a combined idiocy of the governing class. We are now ruled by a body, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, set up by the Conservatives, yet another idiotic quango, which has got a shockingly bad record of forecasting, and yet we've locked ourselves into a budget regime that depends on believing the forecasts of the OBR. So you have the Treasury doing one set of forecasts, as we saw in the amount of money that Rachel thought she might save, was it 5 billion from welfare cuts, and the OBR coming back and saying, oh no, you're only going to save 3.9, and then the entire charade has got to be gone through again. But you see, this is the petty side of it. Let's actually look at what the really big picture is, because that's what everybody should be interested in. What we need to do, we need to go back a year, when Rachel wasn't Rachel from accounts. Rachel was a distinguished economist. She had had a 10-year career, we know, because she told us at the Bank of England. She had continued that career with other major public and private sector employment, and she had proved all of this by writing books. She'd written an autobiography. She had written books on women in politics, and finally, to prove she really was a properly grown-up economist, she had delivered, and almost exactly a year ago, I think it was on the 16th of March, she delivered the MACE lecture, the MAIS lecture, which is the big set-piece lecture on political economy, on government and economics. The London Business School delivered before an adoring audience of journalists and politicians, setting out this new economic theory. Because not only was Rachel an economist, she had a new economic theory, and it was called securonomics. And it involved, of course, like all clever academic theories, it involved reconciling absolutely impossible things. She was going to restore, stabilize the public sector. She was going to increase enormously expenditure on roads, on railways, on houses, on putting public sector workers back where they should be, at the top of the pay hierarchy. She was going to throw 28 billion at that wonderful guarantee of growing an economy, the policies of climate change and wind-powered renewable fuel generation, all of those things, and miraculously, this was going to bring about economic growth. Shall we just examine that? It was hugely applauded by almost all the press. Phrases came up like, and again, this is only a year ago, Rachel is the genuine ideologue of this newly revived Labour Party. She Starmer is merely the political front man. She has come up with a new, and the Guardian headline, for the first time we can now see Labour with a convincing political and economic policy. Her economic career is, of course, largely a fiction. The only thing she has is a master's in economics from LSE, which I can tell you, having invented master's degrees at the London School of Economics, isn't all that much. But the thing that's really disgraceful, Stephen, that was a complete rip-off from Janet Yellen. You're in America. It was a complete rip-off from the political and economic guru of the Biden administration. Janet had been in succession. First of all, she'd been chairman of the Federal Reserve, and then after that she was the Secretary of the Treasury in the Biden administration. And she's responsible for this thing she outlines in a very similar lecture given 2 years earlier at Davos. Needless to say, actually, it was the remote version of Davos, because we were still engaged in the whole business of COVID. Janet gave a lecture on what was called modern supply-side economics. And it consisted of exactly the same things that was talked about in the Mace lecture. Heavy investment in infrastructure, heavy investment in renewables, heavy investment in the general public sector. But there was one enormous difference. In America, it could be done by vast borrowing. Trillions. Actually trillions borrowing. And indeed in America, it did bring about that feverish economic growth of the Biden administration. But it did something else. It, of course, produced vast inflation, because this newfangled thing called either securonomics in Britain or modern supply-side economics in America is just a good old-fashioned Keynesianism. It's pump priming the economy by chucking. Keynes said, it's better to have people digging a hole in the road and filling it up again than to have them unemployed. It is exactly that process. But there was one enormous difference between Yellen and Reeves and between Britain and America. And only one journalist. I mean, if you go back, you look at the headlines she got, they were overwhelmingly favourable. And it powers Labour up to the victory in July. One person, Jason Cowley, a former, I think, editor of the New Statesman, very much on the left, put his finger on it absolutely precisely. He said, this is Bidenomics without the bucks, because you can't borrow in Britain. We're at the limit of borrowing. This is what was demonstrated devastatingly by Liz Truss. We have to see Rachel Reeves as a Liz Truss without the intelligence. It's a terrible thing to say. This is a pre-decayed lettuce. So first of all, she's trying to do something which we know, if she could do it, would lead to devastating inflation. Have you noticed inflation has already bumped very, very sharply up in Britain? Okay, it came down marginally. With this month's figures, but it is certainly going to rise, and I would reckon it will rise very much more sharply than most people are predicting, because of course what she did, she couldn't borrow, but she enormously raised taxes, and she threw those taxes directly into what? Public sector wages, which go straight into the economy. Wages are rising very rapidly in Britain. But let's look at what this really means. It means you have an economic policy which is founded on juju. I call it rain dance economics. They claim they want growth. What do? They increase taxes. This is bizarre. This is simply, in one sense, it's economic illiteracy. You see, I think it's something much more dangerous than that. It is that both she and her master, and Starmer, believe in the state. They actually believe that the state actually shapes us. I mean, have you noticed every time Starmer is confronted by some disaster, he doesn't console the victims first. He praises the emergency services. It's this strange idea that we're held together by the public sector rather than held back by the public sector, which is very obviously what's going on. So you have, at the basis of securonomics, at the basis of Starmer's entire outlook, you have this fundamental statism, which we know doesn't work. So we absolutely does not work, cannot work.
I have to put the defence for Rachel Reeves here. So Sam Bowman, who's
much too intelligent, Stephen.
Well, listen, I'm going to quote someone else. Sam Bowman, who's a conservative or centre-right think tanker, he wrote on Twitter, "I think Reeves is doing a decent job under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I think raising national insurance was the least bad tax rise, and these spending cuts seem judicious, though I would go further on welfare reform. Most of the government's problems are indeed not of its own making, and on planning and infrastructure, it is moving in the right direction, albeit far too slowly and in ways that risk maximising political pain for minimal economic gain." So that's the kind of conservative or centre-right defence of Rachel Reeves.
It's not conservative at all. That is the Labour. That is the omni-party defence, exactly. And the point is, it will guarantee that we continue in exactly the same permanent economic rut that we're in now. But the thing that's much more frightening about it is we are going steadily downhill. Borrowing is steadily increasing. It really is. These are not real cuts. And the whole thing, it is exceedingly likely there will be a need to increase taxes yet again in October. I predict you will then need to increase taxes again the following October, because actually nothing real, none of the areas that really matter are actually being cut. You're simply stopping them growing, perhaps, if these things work, as fast as they were before. What we've got to understand, Stephen, is very simple. We have now got a state, and here again, it's important to recognise that the going wrong goes right back to the New Labour years, and much reinforced by what that dreadful Chancellor George Osborne did. George Osborne's austerity. Again, let me tell you a little story, because stories are always the best way of dealing with this. I had a major confrontation with Osborne. I think it's in about 2012 at a grand dinner at Crosby Moran Hall, in which I told him that his policy of austerity was guaranteed to not simply ruin the economy, it was guaranteed to ruin the public sector. In other words, in 2010, I forecast we would spend more and more money for less and less. This is because he took the decision, apart from protecting, in those days it was who protected the NHS. I mean, look how similar it is. Rachel Reeves is protecting the NHS and defence. What Osborne did was to protect the NHS and what? Overseas aid. All you've done literally is to swap overseas aid for defence in the light of the Ukraine. The policies are absolutely identical. And what they lead to is the progressive deterioration of public services, which nevertheless cost more and more and become more and more inefficient. You see, what did I say to Osborne? I said, remember, we're back in 2012. I said to Osborne, what you should have done was look at what Canada did in the 1990s, when Canada confronted a major fiscal and financial crisis. What you did, you looked at entire areas of public policy that the state could withdraw from. It was so extreme in Canada, they even blew up hospitals. You decide there are entire areas of the state the entire areas of bureaucracy, entire areas of administration, we will give up. I mean, we have 444 quangos. 444, to which they have added 28 and abolished one, right? This ludicrous overreach of the state. What we've got to do, we've to go back to fundamentals and to decide what we don't need to do. We've to look genuinely radically at welfare. We've got to ask, for example, statementing, this whole business if a child has special needs, which may be established by what? Mildly disagreeable behaviour, which is now medicalised. What does that child get? It gets the right to private transport to school every day. Single children are costing hundreds of thousands a year. This is deranged. We've got, in other words, what we're doing now is we're simply trying to keep a sinking ship afloat. We've instead got to bail out radically.
One thing you haven't mentioned is immigration, and we've got this huge welfare state, and suddenly you have this massive influx of immigrants, some of whom have started to access that welfare state and is costing the economy billions of pounds. There's also pressure on infrastructure, housing, schools, and so on. And we saw recently Philip Hammond going on TV saying we need more immigration to boost the economy, Fraser Nelson saying similar things. The Labour government have historically been in favour of immigration, all for economic reasons. They say we need these people to boost productivity, to fill jobs that British people won't do. What about the impact of immigration on the economy? Do you think it's been a good thing or a bad thing?
It's catastrophic, because what we've done on the whole is to import, and again, one needs to be careful about this, in general, since again, we left the EU, in particular since we left the EU, we've imported the worst category of unskilled immigrants. In other words, we've imported, say, huge numbers of carers. And we've imported not simply carers, but vast numbers of their families. There is now direct evidence from Britain, from Denmark, from many countries in Europe, that many nationalities are themselves immediately a burden on the public purse. And yet we've heard from Philip Hammond, we've heard from Fraser Nelson, this maniacal insistence that it's a good thing. You see, this is what is so wonderful about what's happening with Trump in America. This veil of respectable utterance that one has to say, of course welfare is a good thing, of course being caring is a good thing, of course immigration is a good thing, of course liberal interventionism is a good thing. Suddenly all that veil's been ripped off, and you can actually begin to see underneath cold, hard reality. See, one of the great problems, Stephen, was that the Conservative Party decided it wanted to be nice. You will remember Theresa May talked of the nasty party. She, a Conservative Prime Minister, on the steps of Downing Street, gives a speech on burning injustices and what we have to do to correct them. In other words, we've had the left, we've had the classical phrase, piling Mount Pelion on Mount Ossa. You've had the soppiness of the left for welfare and immigration piled on by the renewed soppiness of the right. And even when the right pretended that it was being economically hard-headed over immigration, it was actually making things worse. We have had 30-odd years of catastrophic public policy, which is why we are where we are now. It's why you may have seen the latest stuff that our mutual friend Matt Goodwin has done, looking at the popular opinion of politicians. There is now an imprecation on all parties, including increasingly his beloved Reform, that there is just this general sense, and do you know what? The people are right. We've had policies which are based on lies and deliberate dishonesty over climate change, deliberate dishonesty over COVID, deliberate dishonesty over immigration and multiculturalism. And what's happening, what I think is also happening with Labour, and we need to broaden it, some different Rachel Reeves. What is the great difference between this March and last March, the March of the Spring Statement, 2025, and the March of 2024, the Mace Lecture, is the brutal confrontation with reality. Because what we've now got extraordinarily, we have Labour MPs saying we've got to withdraw from the ECHR. We've got a Labour MP who says basically the whole structure, which I've talked about, of the Blairite state, which is designed to replace the power of elected representatives, that's Parliament, by experts on one hand, the inhabitants of these quangos. And by the way, immigration is subject to yet another quango, the Migration Advisory Committee, with the experts of the quangos on the one hand, and more particularly judges on the other hand. And Labour MPs are now realising that the proper operations of government are being hobbled. But there's a problem, isn't it? This system was primarily the creation of New Labour from 1997 to 2010, and then it's doubled down on by the catastrophic governments that followed. First the coalition government, and then the May government, the Boris government, and the Sunak government. In other words, and I think I made the point brilliantly, did I not, by comparing, I always do, Osborne and Reeves. I mean, the identical nature of their politics. And until we break from this, until we recognise what's gone wrong, we'll get nowhere. But the trouble is, Labour invented it. Labour's heart and soul is in this. You see the backbenchers reacting against what are really tiny cuts. I pointed out, welfare is, disability benefits will be very soon pushing 100 billion a year. Pushing 100 billion. So at this point, you're getting into serious money as opposed to 1%. You're getting to 10% of the budget, and yet, of course, they will not countenance doing anything about it. And there's an even bigger thing. Starmer and the Attorney General, Richard Hermer, they are completely bought into the world of the legal overarching structure which binds all this together, which turns the ECHR from simply a semi-silly document into a totally insane document. That somebody can't be, a criminal can't be deported to Pakistan because he's a chronic drunk, that somebody else can't be deported because their child only likes English crisps or whatever it is. This is but we laugh. But they are fundamentally committed to this. The only decent biography of Keir Starmer says that the one consistent thing you can see in this man is his commitment to the idea of human rights law and this peculiar notion of the rule of law. So long as you're committed to that, you can't really do anything about this. So the only way in which the Labour Party can really begin to confront reality is by tearing itself apart. It has got to pull itself apart. I may very well be that pressure forces them to do this. I mean, what is striking, of course, is just how much Starmer has betrayed. His entire career. We talked about lies, in one sense, being the foundation. But Starmer has kicked over every single thing that he has embraced. He was on the far left of the Labour Party. He's basically, I think, a Trotskyite. On the far left of the Labour Party. He was a serious supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. He proclaimed Corbyn a friend. At every stage, you have seen him kick over every promise that he's made, every loyalty that he had. And my guess is that with this ruthlessness, as he said himself, I find being ruthless easy, he will even have to tear his lawyer soul out. The only way he will survive.
Since 1997, you make this very good point that Blair changed everything constitutionally, but also on the economy. I think at that time, 37% of GDP was spent on government spending, and now it's 45% of the economy. And after the Second World War, you saw this economic consensus. I think it was called Butzkitalism or something.
It's named after Hugh Gaitskell and Rab Butler. Hugh Gaitskell, the Labour man, Rab Butler, the Tory man, with a consensus, again, on very much. We talked about Keynesianism. It was a consensus on Keynesianism. It was a consensus on heavy state intervention, large-scale taxation and borrowing, and trying to control the trade unions by prices and income. Lincoln's policies.
Okay, so very briefly, my question is this. After that consensus, you had Margaret Thatcher and Enoch Powell and Joseph, I've forgotten his surname, Keith Joseph, basically destroying that consensus in the 80s. And some conservatives today, people like Simon Heffer, say, well, look, David, we've got a solution. It's staring right in front of us. It's called Kemi Badenoch and Mel Stride and Chris Phil. She is the new Margaret Thatcher. She is going to destroy this economic consensus and bring a renewal that Thatcher brought in the 80s, but in 2029. What's your response?
Well, do you know what? I would like to believe that was possible. The trouble is, I think it is and I don't want to go too far into risque territory here, unlike my usual self. It illustrates the fact that it's focused on Kemi Badenoch illustrates the fascination of a male section of the Conservative Party with the female dominatrix. I'm not quite sure what is Kemi's equivalent of a handbag, but conservatives of Simon Heffer's generation long for a firm slap. You know, that whole the intensely camp world of Thatcher's cabinet, with people like Norman St. John Stevens, addressing the Prime Minister as Tina, there is no alternative. I mean, that whole florid world of the one woman.
Well, Tim Stanley, just very briefly, Tim Stanley of The Telegraph, by the way, a great man, big fan of his, but he described Kemi Badenoch as mummy in a column.
Precisely. And this is ludicrous. She's also, I think, shown no real grasp of fundamentals. This notion of values floating around there. What we need is hard policy. It's perfectly clear what's happened. If you go back to Thatcher and Keith Joseph, what happened? You talked of the Butts-Kalight consensus. The Butts-Kalight consensus collapsed in 1972, 1973, with the equivalent of the Liz Truss budget then. It was the Barber boom. And the Barber boom blew up the economy and actually much, much worse than the Truss budget. I mean, I was buying a house, my first flat in London. Do you know how much property prices went up in 1 year? 3 times. In 1 year. It makes our present fiscal crisis look relatively modest, though remember it was against a background of much, much lower borrowing than we have now. So Butts-Kalism blew up in that. And then the following year, you have Keith Joseph. Maybe, who knows, maybe you're talking to a successor, I'd like to imagine that I was, realised that this consensus had been catastrophic. And he comes up with this wonderful phrase, I have called myself a conservative, but I haven't been a conservative. I've been a member, because he had been, of a conservative government which didn't do anything conservative. What we can now see, we are in the terrible mess that we are. The Conservative Party was repudiated in the way that it was last year because it did nothing conservative. I mean, if you actually look, everything continued exactly as it was. The state got bigger. Public services got worse. Taxation got higher. Immigration got greater. Woke became more omnipresent. And you had a Conservative Prime Minister, for heaven's sake, David Cameron, saying that the most important thing that he did was to legalise gay marriage. I'm gay, but for a soi-disant Conservative Prime Minister to say that that was his principal achievement, it's a politics of the madhouse. You've quoted Tim Stanley once. Let's quote Tim again. It's wonderful to get you a sense of this extraordinary cross-dressing that's going on at the moment. Vote Conservative and get higher taxes. Vote Labour and get welfare cuts. What we've got to do, we've to break this. And the great problem is, I'm afraid, that reform, for internal reasons and the fact that Farage is a brilliant single-issue politician but isn't interested in serious policy, isn't capable of working with people who actually could put such serious policies together, reform isn't the answer either. We are, unlike America, where all of these similar forces were in operation. You have somebody who, like Trump, who In some ways, I mean, he's very much more to the right at the moment than Farage. I mean, in many ways, he is. There's almost an element of Tommy Robinson about it. But he was able to call into the coalition a remarkable group of intelligent and able people, including some of the richest and the most intelligent in America, who come up with serious policy options. The most able of them, not even shunting aside Elon Musk. But what I'm saying is, in America, you actually had a disruptor coming in with serious policy ideas, and some very much off the wall ones, but with serious policy preparation. We will only escape from this once we have serious policies and the willingness to be radical, which of course is where Doge comes in. And what Musk is trying to do is exactly what I was talking about with George Osborne back in 2012. There's also another very interesting example. It's what and you don't often, I don't often offer compliments to the European Central Bank. But what the ECB did with Ireland, with Portugal and Greece at the time of their last great financial crisis was to force these radical cuts on them, to force genuine cutbacks in the operation of the state, and which are the booming economies in Europe now? Ireland, Greece, and Portugal, bizarrely. We've got to do something similar. And what that means, again, it means doing what Milei has been doing in Argentina. You have to take a radical axe, or a chainsaw, if you prefer it, to the whole structure of the state. We cannot keep going the way we are now. We're in a doom loop.
Shakespeare is being celebrated in schools across England, Britain this week. Before we get on to attempts to cancel him, because there have been some recent attempts, can you just assess Shakespeare's legacy in Britain over the last 400 years?
Shakespeare becomes the figure that we think of in the 18th century, when David Garrick, the great actor at the time, invents the first Shakespeare centenary with the great celebrations in Stratford-on-Avon, and the idea which emerges forcibly at that point, that Shakespeare is the equivalent of the great writers of classical antiquity, of Homer, of Virgil, as the shaper of an entire culture, the culture of the English-speaking world, its frame of reference, its romance, its political seriousness, its soul. Shakespeare transform. To read Shakespeare is to enter into worlds that normally are closed to you. You read a Shakespeare play, you can become a king. You can read a Shakespeare play, you have the world of magic. You read a Shakespeare play, you become, like Othello, obsessed with the hideousness of jealousy that leads to murder. Read Macbeth. Well, of course, you simply see the politics of Scotland between sturgeon and salmon. I always say Macbeth demonstrates that it's not simply a play, but it's a documentary. But you penetrate that world of infinite political ambition that leads to a limitless violence, to a limitless appetite for power, and to its self-destruction. And Shakespeare then works as, I think, the counterpoint to the other side of the English genius. At the same time that you created this extraordinary, Shakespeare really recreates English. The founder poet of English 2 centuries earlier, at the end of the 14th century, in the 1300s, is Geoffrey Chaucer. And what Chaucer does, he begins the process of fusing French and English. The reason that and which is really a Germanic dialect. The reason that English is such an extraordinary language is that it fuses the two very different sorts of culture, because languages incorporate culture. And then what Shakespeare does, he brings in the whole world of the newly discovered Latin and Greek of the 15th and the 16th centuries. Let me give you a quote from Macbeth. This is Lady Macbeth. She's encouraged Macbeth to commit murder. She dreams constantly and sleepwalks, imagining her hands soaked in blood. These extraordinary lines. Who would have thought the old man had so much blood in him? Now just look at the simplicity and yet the horror. That's Tarantino stuff. And then it goes on. She imagines she's got to wash. She's got to try to get it off. And she goes in sleepwalking through the motions of washing her hands. And now, can I get it off? No, I can't. Not all the water in the wide blue sea. Rather it would rather this, and then suddenly after the simplicity, it would rather the multitudinous seas in Carnadine, the Latin. This is extraordinary. And to watch, I saw a performance of Richard II a week or so ago. That moment at which you see Richard stripping himself of royalty, that extraordinary use of words like, I used to monarchize. Imagine, you can suddenly see it, the strutting, the preening, the draping oneself in robes, the waving a finger, and then suddenly the awful sense of all that being torn off you when the robes have bound themselves to your flesh, you know. That's what it does. And what it does, Shakespeare gives us the images that the ancient world got out of the Greek myths. It creates at that level. At the same time, some of the plays are wonderful in the sense of the Romeo and Juliet, the wonderful myth of youthful love and its destructiveness, as we see every day, don't we, on Twitter or TikTok, and the consequences of it. Or again, the amazing play Troilus and Cressida, about political ambition and moral corruption, in which it ends with one of its leading characters putting himself into his coffin, suffering from syphilis, and calling his diseases down on the audience. You know, modern theatre can barely get as risque as that. It's simply astonishing. What worries me is when you get some petty fools who are actually commissioned to write their reports by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust at the Anne Hathaway's cottage and all the rest of it, saying, oh, we've got to push this aside because it signifies the superiority of white culture. The self-destructiveness, the folly, the stupidity. Because remember, England is extraordinary. It is why I constantly say we are, and Shakespeare understood it in his plays, the new Rome. The British Empire invents modernity, gives the world law, gives it systems of international law, international trade. But the English language, like Latin, again, shapes how it thinks, how it works, what matters, and we're throwing it away. If you look, we're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about America. Why are people like Vance and Musk, why is there this, indeed Trump himself, why is there this strange love-hate relationship with Britain? Because that's what it amounts to. They recognise, Musk says it constantly, Vance writes about it, they recognise, and Trump even have it in his bones in a funny kind of way, with his reverence for the monarchy and Scotland and so on. They recognise what Britain did historically, just how much it is the parent of America. They say it. We come from it. But then they look at how we've miserably torn ourselves apart. I mean, the latest exchange, you'll remember, when Representative whatever it was so rude to a Sky journalist. What was the point? It wasn't simply, you don't matter, you're a silly little country. What she said, listen, I'm sure you will be able to quote it back at me more accurately than I can. What she said is, you want to question me about how we handle our frontiers. Look at how you mishandle yours. Look at how you've given up the defining characteristic of the nation state that can protect its frontiers and protect its people. It is this sense that we've thrown it away, that we who invented the idea of representative democracy have thrown it away, that the New Labour years, with their determination to remove power from Parliament, the ancestral representative assembly, betrayed Britain, betrayed everything that mattered about Britain, betrayed everything that was good about Britain. And remember, the word betray is very closely related to the word traitor. And I'm afraid we are at that moment. This is what Vance is really on about. He is saying that Europe has betrayed itself. It has destroyed what mattered about it with this vision of liberal democracy, which inverts the idea of democracy, turns it on its head. Rather than we the people, remember the opening of the American Constitution, we the people, the idea of rule by the majority. In the European model, which unfortunately under Blair, Britain bought into, we the people are mistrusted. We the people are wicked right-wing, armpit-scratching populists who are to be kept under control by experts, under control by lawyers, are made to subordinate ourselves to minorities, as we have seen very clearly with the sentencing, with the extraordinary decisions of the Sentencing Policy Council and so on. So this is why there is this rupture within the West. What the Trumpites are not just being rude, they are being rude. They're being very rude, and they're being rightly rude, in my view. I remember the rudest man in Britain because I tried to tell the truth. The truth is painful. We've lived in a world of shallow illusion for so long, and suddenly, I mean, what Trump is doing, what Vance more eloquently is doing, it's saying that the English, the British, the European emperor has got no clothes. He's not only stark naked, he's diseased.
We'll get on to Trump at the end, but I just want to stick with Shakespeare very briefly. I'm going to put you on the spot here, but I know you like to do that with me. With Shakespeare, can you tell us about Shakespeare's contemporary influence? And also, how did he influence Britain in the coming centuries after his death, not in the 20th or 21st century? I think we, as you mentioned, this kind of attempt to cancel him as a white, sort of trying to decolonize him or whatever. But what was his influence at the time and subsequently, in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries?
The moment at which, as I said, he is turned recognisably and deliberately into an English icon is in the later 18th century, at exactly the moment that you get the heightened sense of Anglo-Britain, Anglo-Scotland, Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, as this ascendant world power. And it is very much part of this. It's part of the invention of Westminster Abbey, again, as placing Shakespeare's bust there, as a national Valhalla, and so on. It's our awareness of us as a great power with a great literature. Just happens to be true. Contemporaries recognise it too in the 16th century. The fact that Shakespeare's plays are printed in the form of the first folio. The first folio, what it means, it's enormous. It means simply a single folded sheet. So it's a size of book that normally you only use for the most important and distinguished stuff. So the publication of Shakespeare in the first folio is a recognition by near contemporaries that he was a figure of iconic importance at the time. That's why these plays survive. Normally, remember, they're just thrown away because there is this completely different attitude to performance then and now. I mentioned the play Richard II. Richard II is performed on one very memorable occasion, when there is going to be a major rebellion, and the rebels tell Shakespeare's company, "We want you to enact this play because we intend to overthrow Elizabeth II. Elizabeth, because we want to overthrow Elizabeth I." And do you know what the Lord Chamberlain's men, these are the people who are performing Shakespeare, say to the Earl of Essex advisors? They say, "Oh, come on, we can't put this play on. We've performed it before. Nobody's going to turn up." And so what the Earl of Essex does, he slips them a couple of quid, because in those days £2 was rather a lot of money, and they put the play on. So the very fact that you have the folio, you have this huge formal printing of the works with an engraving, with dedicatory verses, they themselves recognise Shakespeare is up there with Virgil. He's up there with Homer. And most interestingly, Stephen, they recognise he is up there and better than Chaucer. They'd already, again, we've got to understand how conscious these people are of, if you like, cultural politics. We think cultural politics are very modern. Let me tell you, Chaucer, of course, is much earlier. Chaucer is the late 14th century. At exactly the moment that England is emerging aggressively, setting itself deliberately against Europe at the time of the Reformation, in 1532, what you do is you get the first full publication in print, because Chaucer had been circulated in manuscript. You get the first full publication of Chaucer in print. It's printed by the King's printer. It's an official work. The preface is written by the equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's written by Sir Brian Tuke, the Treasurer of the Chamber. Wonderfully, you can tell how busy lives were in those days. He's waiting for his boat to be able to turn round outside Greenwich Palace so he could return to Westminster. And he writes this preface in which he hails Chaucer as two things, as the equivalent of Homer and the equivalent of Virgil. But he also says English is now a great language. So you're playing cultural politics. And similarly, the rise of Shakespeare is the rise of English, the displacement of French in exactly the same way that the English swept aside France. Remember, the thing that really creates our world, and Winston Churchill, another great writer, politics and writing always coming together. Churchill gets his Nobel Prize for literature. He doesn't get it for anything else, he gets it for literature. And it's Churchill who characterises the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, as the First World War, because that's the war in which the British defeat the French in India and in Canada. And that determines that the world will speak English. And it determines that the central literary figures will not be Molière, will not be Racine, will not be the greats of French literature. They'll be Shakespeare and they'll be Dickens. And for us to throw that away, for us to, as it were, say, "Oh, no, we don't want that," it's suicide.
It's a cultural revolution akin to what Mao was doing in the 1960s. So let's talk about another way that they're trying to attack our culture and our religion. There's this school in Eastleigh, I think it's Norwood Primary School, and it's scrapped its annual Easter celebrations to be inclusive of other religions and for this reason of inclusivity and diversity. Do you think that Christian and English traditions will still exist in this country in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, or is it on the path of total destruction?
I think it's on the path of dying. The problem is, of course, that we've been able to be so confident about ourselves that we haven't needed to be aggressive. I think this is the thing that's most important to remember. Again, when we talk about the importance of Christianity, I'm a little I don't buy this idea that this Tom Holland idea that we're a product of Judeo-Christian values. I think that our politics is much more, as the very language of politics would suggest, a product of the classical world. After all, we talk about democracy and we talk about populism. These are words that derive directly from Latin and Greek. But what's important to understand about Britain was, of course, Britain was never a single nation. How can it be? We're a united kingdom of Scotland and England, two countries of radically, very, very different, distinct traditions, although sharing broadly a common language, and by the 17th century a common religion, various forms of Protestantism. But this fact, the fact that right from the beginning we are a multinational society, this is crucial to understand. Virtually every other country in Europe is a product of a deliberate moment of national creation. France, yes, of course, it exists as a great monarchy in the period up to the Revolution, but it's a series of fragments. And with the revolution, you embark on a policy of making sure that you use a state educational system to impose a single vision of Frenchness. Germany, Italy, they're the same. We never did that. We've never had a policy of Britonizing. When I was a young man, nobody called themselves a Briton or a Brit. Unthinkable. You were English or you were Scots. You might be British abroad. The only time you really used the term British was when you were talking about horrors like British Rail or British Leyland, British Gas, the dreadful creations of the first LabCon state. And it's the fact that we were able to take ourselves for granted makes us so vulnerable. The fact that we had such a profoundly individualized culture, which valued oddness and eccentricity, makes us immensely, and that we adjusted our rules, that we were so intensely, we deliberately destroy the communism of tribes and so on. All of that makes us immensely vulnerable when we have immigrants who themselves are deeply communal, who themselves have tribal structures, who can use our individual freedoms to impose their communal values. And this is profoundly dangerous. Because I think without Islam, Christianity would have survived much more easily as a set of quaint traditions. I mean, it seems to me that if you look at Easter, if you look at Christmas, what they've essentially done is to transmogrify into folk rituals. I mean, most people don't get terribly excited about the idea of the birth of Christ at Christmas, but they get jolly excited about Christmas pudding, maybe even the Festival of Lessons and Carols, because it sounds nice, about Father Christmas, about gift giving, about overeating. Easter again is Easter eggs and hot cross bun. This sort. You see what I mean? They become folk rituals. The reason that there's been this violent, which have survived because they became commercialized. It's only the presence of this, and I am going to use the force deliberately, alien force of Islam, which for reasons that in many ways it's very difficult to understand, our leftish masters, and indeed our monarchy, feel obliged to suck up to, that as it were, a counter-ideology has come in. And because again, the people who had led the attack on Christianity, people like Richard Dawkins, proclaimed themselves cultural Christians. How do I describe myself? Leading atheist. I'm a high church atheist. Do you see what I mean? The aggressiveness of the demolition, like the literal taking over of churches by mosques, rather than just letting them fade into community centres. You see the difference? And there's a new aggression about it all. In the same way that I think, if you look at the Roman world, yes, of course, the world of the idols and of the gods of Rome was rooted out by Christianity, but the temples were taken over. They were Christianized. The priests, the Christian priests, started to look awfully like the priests of the old religion. The Pope actually uses the titles, the old imperial title of Pontifex Maximus, of high, the literal title of high priest, so it is this incursion of a wildly different, aggressive, conquering religion. Again, remember, the great difference between Christianity and Islam is a religion of conquest. It always advanced with the sword. Christianity is a religion of conversion. And there's a radical difference between the two.
Well, the interesting thing about Islam in Britain is that it is on the rise. It's rapidly on the rise. You can see that in the census figures, but particularly among the young and younger people and children, this is where Islam is expanding the most. And that's why this story about the school in Eastleigh is interesting to me, because it's kind of how it impacts young people. But let's move on from Islam and Christianity. Let's talk about America just very briefly, my final question. And this is actually about the Commonwealth. Now, I know you've been critical of the Commonwealth in the past. Someone like Enoch Powell thinks the Commonwealth should be completely shut down. Donald Trump has kind of tweeted, maybe jokingly, that he would accept coming into the Commonwealth, America joining the Commonwealth. But he's also been very vocal about Canada, a key member of the Commonwealth. He wants it to become the 51st state. You know, he's joking that Trudeau and the new Prime Minister Carney is the governor of Canada. What do you think of this kind of almost like an attack on the Commonwealth from Trump through Canada, but also this potential of America joining the Commonwealth?
Well, I think it's the difference between symbol and reality. That Trump is fascinated by symbols. Trump and signatures. Look at Trump when he received the letter from King Charles. Look at that signature. He again deploys Trump, and again it's why the American presidency has become successful. The American presidency has learned to deploy much of the language of personal monarchy. Right? Trump is brilliantly good at, it's a kind of Caesarism as well, but a Caesarism, thank God, without the fact that he is directly at the head of the army and with the Praetorian Guard outside the White House, rather than just a handful of rather handsome Marines. But so what we've got to distinguish then is Trump's fascination with the Commonwealth as a symbol of things he likes: golf, palaces, big signatures, a sentimental Englishness. That's what it's about. And he finds it, I think, much easier to deal with King Charles, though I'm quite sure King Charles detests him with every refined atom in the royal body. He finds it much easier to deal with King Charles because he thinks of Charles inhabiting these magnificent palaces, beautifully dressed, with great art around him, deploying all the symbols of wealth, much more as a real ruler than he actually is. Trump, of course, manages to combine the symbols. I mean, what's he doing? He's actually started gilding the Oval Office. He started Mar-a-Lagoing the Oval Office. He's trying to introduce that array of great gold vases on the mantelpiece in the Oval Office, the gilding of the details of the overdoors and whatever. He's palacifying. I talked about monarchizing. He's palacifying the White House. But that's simply the world of symbol. What is the problem with Canada? What we've got to understand, and our conversation is, as usual, going in really interesting wheels. Canada is European. Canada is, in many ways, the most extreme European state. In other words, what Canada decided to do under Trudeau, father and son, was to, as far as possible, repudiate its Anglo-Scottish foundations, to apologise for colonisation, to restore the rights of First People, to rip the Union Jack out of its flag, to produce this weird flag, which, as somebody once said, could be saluted in drunken error by a Peruvian policeman. You know, this thing with the maple leaf on it, to embark on a policy of radical and unlimited immigration, of grotesque growth in public expenditure, of a similar failed economy, of the reluctance to exploit national resources, of Carney again embodying green and climate change policies and so on. So what he sees is Canada as the absolute embodiment of everything he detests about Europe. But also, therefore, he sees it as rescuing it. You see, this again is the point that Vance is making, which we in Europe have just not understood. It's not that he's just being rude about Europe. Again, when he talks about freeloading and people respond with those very affecting photographs of the coffins that were brought in at Brize Norton and all the rest of it, of people British soldiers who had been killed in Afghanistan or in Iraq. That's not what he's talking about. And when he says, countries that haven't fought a war, people have misunderstood that. They said, but we fought in your wars. When he said, you haven't fought a war, that means you haven't got independent military capacity. Because the last time we half fought a war was the Falklands, and the last time we properly fought a war, though it was made sure we couldn't complete it by the Americans, was Suez. And he sees Canada as the epitome of this, as the extreme case of this. But in all cases, Musk, Vance, Trump himself, sees as need rescuing from these failed elites, restoring to the American model, which interestingly enough, again, Stephen, it's that world of the mid-18th century. America is that world of the mid-18th century. What Trump is doing when he's talking about, and you've left out Greenland, when he's talking about Greenland, when he's talking about Canada, he's back to that world of the 7 Years' War, which the Americans call the Franco-Indian War. That's the war which is fought by a Britain led by William Pitt the Elder. All places across America are named after Pitt, including Pittsburgh, because he's the one who believed in the manifest destiny of the English world, who believed in the destruction of France, in the triumph of liberty, and bizarrely, of course, in the triumph of slavery as well. That there is that wonderful phrase in Dr. Johnson that nobody yelps more loudly for liberty than a Yankee slave driver. And what we've got to understand is America, the US, comes out of that world of the 18th century. And it comes out of the world of the 18th century, which of course also adores Shakespeare. The greatest institutions supporting Shakespeare are in America. The Folger Shakespeare Library in DC, the extraordinary structure of theatres all across America. And they are much more self-conscious of this culture than we are ourselves. Again, Trump saying, I want to sort out the Kennedy Center. And there's been so little, and I'm really delighted with the conversation we've had, there's been so little attempt at explaining all of this. They see themselves as our better selves. They see the world of the so-called liberal European-style democracy correctly as a world of weakness.
Well, Vance talks about Europe basically committing civilizational suicide through immigration, and I think that the Danish Prime Minister agreed with him, and I'm sure that probably a lot of Europeans would agree with that. And it's funny, in Canada, you talk about them destroying their symbols of their British history. I think on their passport, they removed an image of Vimy Ridge, this famous World War I victory for the Canadians in which many, many thousands of Canadians died. They removed that and they replaced it with an image of a squirrel. So that's what's happening in Canada.
It is pathetic. On the other hand, you now see, bizarrely, Carney trying to reincarnate Canadian patriotism in
He's very
exactly
Blairite. He's sort of attacking the Conservatives from the right, and he's
that. Well,
learning from
it's
Tony Blair.
sort of pseudo, but it's exactly the same thing that's happened here. Have you not seen the people who are clamouring most loudly for war in the Ukraine are liberals? There's been this total, again, this, you can tell we're in a moment of the complete decay of a political structure. This total inversion of politics. Again, the Tim Stanley point. Get a liberal, vote liberal, get war. Vote Starmer, get patriotism. But of course it's false. It's untrue, because these people are also committed to open-ended immigration. They're committed to a thoroughly woke approach to our past. There's again a wild inconsistency. Wild.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us. I appreciate your time yet again.
A pleasure.